Hello and welcome to Liberty Hub, Faith and Reason. My name is Ana Maria Pacuraru and today I will be investigating alongside Dr. Mihail Namtu the secular persecution of Christianity worldwide. On the table we have Boris Johnson's pledge to stand up for Christians in his first Christian message to the UK. We also have the York Minster statue of Roman Emperor Constantine that could be torn down after complaints that he supported slavery. We then see Nigeria at risk of Rwandan-style genocide as 60,000 were killed by Boko Haram and ISIS in the decade. And then we get hit on the 1st of July with the news coming from the U.S. Department of State in which the United States of America urges the government of Turkey that they continue to maintain the Hagia Sophia as a museum, and I quote, as an exemplar of its commitment to respect the faith and traditions and diverse history that contributed to the Republic of Turkey and to ensure it remains accessible to all, since the United States views a change in the status of the Hagia Sophia as diminishing the legacy of this remarkable building and its unsurpassed ability, so rare in the modern world, to serve humanity as a much-needed bridge between those of differing faith, traditions, and cultures. End of quote. We later take a look at Trump's struggle to save Christianity right in his backyard. Then we set the ironic question if China is the best example of social doctrine of the church. And finally, we conclude with a new religious fusion between Christianity and Islam that has attracted quite a few followers. But first of all, I would like to welcome my co-host, my dear friend Mike. Thank you, Mike, for joining me today. Mike, you're a fine observer and have studied theology quite extensively. What are your first thoughts on this Christian and secular persecution of Christians, basically?
I have studied actually the history of early Christianity, and what strikes me is the fact that today perhaps more Christians are being persecuted across the globe than in the first 2 or 3 centuries. The early church was very proud, so to speak, of its great martyrs. I mean, we are broadcasting this from Bucharest, and we're not far away from Dobroja, which is very close to the Black Sea. It used to be called Scythia Minor. We had lots of Christians being killed and persecuted in the first or 2 or 3 centuries there. Some of them even went to Nicaea in order to establish the first creed of the early church. That's the Nicene Creed. I think here of Bishop Theotim, who left Tomis, that is Constanza today, went there being wounded. So we have a long story of persecutions in the first 2 or 3 centuries of the Roman Empire. St. Paul was also martyred. Peter was also martyred. We know of Andrew, the disciple of the Lord, being persecuted. It's no news that Christians are being targeted everywhere. However, the narrative of modernity in political terms was that once we establish these new institutions like the secular university, parliamentary rule and all that, we will finally get rid of inter-religious wars on the one hand and I would say inter-confessional disputations, so to speak. Unfortunately, despite these wonderful predictions that one day we will all live in a beautiful world in which, like John Lennon put it, you remember very well that song, there's no religion and there's no division of sorts. I mean, unlike what we thought 2020 would be, we are witnessing, and it's not just me, but lots of important people in the world, sociologists, philosophers, historians, and diplomats, and I include here an important diplomat from the United Kingdom, Jeremy Hunt, who used to be the foreign secretary. We are all discovering the fact that Christianity is the most persecuted religion on earth. So again, we had a narrative telling us one day, because of modernity, because of globalization, because of the liberal democracy being spread all over the place, we will see a full cessation, of any form of discrimination. Well, unfortunately, that's not the case. We see lots of victims of persecution, of anti-Christian persecution in Egypt, in Sudan, in Turkey even, Turkey being very willing to join the EU still. We see persecution of Christians in Nigeria, in Rwanda. We see persecution of Christians in China. Perhaps we'll get to that later. And finally, we see not per se a persecution, not necessarily a persecution, but we are witnessing a marginalization, a social, I would say, discrimination of Christians even in the free countries of the world, that is Australia, America, Canada, and parts of Europe. Why is that? Because probably our elites have forgotten to study the gospel, the foundational texts of our religion. It's a long story. It needs to be very well discussed.
Now let's take a quick glance at Trump's struggle to save Christianity, because the Middle East was the hearth in which Christianity was born 2,000 years ago. Today, Christians barely survive in this historic region. Tawfiq Balkini is an American of Lebanese origin and the president of the board of directors of the Organization in Defense of Christians. For many years, he has been committed to preserving the historic Christian communities in the Middle East. He has repeatedly expressed his optimism towards Washington and the Trump administration, where he believes the salvation of this hearth of Christianity, which is the Middle East, will come from within. In Iraq, Vice President Mike Pence's promise that aid is on the way was realized by allocating $300 million from U.S. aid to the country's religious minorities. And Tawfiq Balkini points out that Donald Trump made history by signing a law on Iraq and Syria, which allows religious minorities for the first time, the most vulnerable targets of Islamism in two countries, to receive direct aid from the U.S. government. The Trump administration set another spectacular precedent by sanctioning Turkey, although it is an ally of NATO, until Pastor Andrew Brunson was released. In Egypt, continued pressure from the U.S. Congress has prompted President Abdel el-Sisi to take important steps in favor of Coptic security, especially by prosecuting terrorists, rebuilding churches destroyed by them, and appointing the first woman governor of the Coptic religion of an Egyptian province. Egypt currently receives $1.6 billion in aid, largely related to the rights of religious minorities. In Lebanon, the United States continues to support the Lebanese armed forces and regularly denounces the interference of Iran and other Islamic powers in the region. What do you think about Trump's struggle to save Christianity? We know that he preserves the monuments and he preserves Christian symbols. Why is that? What do you think demands him to do such a thing?
First of all, the story of Mr. Trump is an interesting one. He was brought up in a family in which the Bible was a very important document, a very important book. By the way, the Bible, I think he kept in his hand when he went to that famous church, Episcopalian church close to the White House, was the Bible that was given to him by his mother, Anne Marie McLeod.
And he received a lot of backlash because of it.
He received a lot of backlash because he's called by some leftists a hypocrite. Well, it's true that part of Mr. Trump's life was very much, I would say, the life of a prodigal son. You know, it's true that, you know, in his mid-age career as a businessman in New York, he didn't spend a lot of time studying necessarily the sacred scripture. But it's also true that when he was young, when he was 17, he used to attend a Bible study group, and he learned from his mother, as I said, who was a Scottish, I think she's Episcopalian, yeah? She used to be Episcopalian, she passed away. He learned the basics, I would say. I mean, irrespective of his personal relationship to God, which might be still a mystery for all of us, what we can say for sure is that his wife, Melania, is a rather pious woman. I mean, she is a Catholic. When she visited Vatican, she spent a lot of time in prayer. We saw that. We can also say that he, as a public person, Mr. Trump, has respect for religion, has respect for the religious symbols. You might not, for instance, you might not practice football, but you will always show respect for the great soccer players, for the great stars of that particular sport. You will always basically praise the champions. I think Mr. Trump is in the same position. He might not necessarily be every day in church, but he knows that the greatest heroes of Christianity need to be applauded in public. And obviously there's another influence that Mr. Trump is getting, and that's the influence of Mike Pompeo, who is a devout Christian. He's the Minister of Foreign Affairs in the United States. Mike Pompeo, the chief diplomat of the American state. And then Mike Pence. Mike Pence is, I think he's called a Catholic evangelical or an evangelical Catholic. He discovered God in a particular circumstance, just like Ben Carson. Ben Carson also found God in a particular stressful moment when he almost killed somebody.
Many people have even read his books. And
yeah, he hit somebody very powerfully, and that guy was almost, killed in the event. And Ben Carson realized how precious a human life is. He turned back to God, and Ben Carson is another person in Trump's cabinet who projects a very positive influence upon Mr. Trump, upon the president, when it comes to defending Christianity. Finally, there's another figure, I think a very important figure for the Republican Party, who very much influences, I think, the public discourse of Mr. Trump, and that's Ted Cruz. He ran against Mr. Trump in the most recent elections, but he, despite the fact that he lost, he is a very, very influential figure in the South. So you've got Trump by himself, and then you've got the Republican actors who have the courage still to defend the Christian faith. And that's good for us, and that's good for America. One thing he also did, and we have to mention that, is he established this department defending religious freedom across the globe. So for the first time in the last, I think, 30 years, we see a member of the American government, basically, an ambassador at large, Mr. Brownback, I think that's his name, visiting different countries, trying to influence leaders around the globe to call them to pay attention to the suffering of the Christians, to ask them to respect the human rights. And I think the story of that pastor who was rescued from Turkey, you remember that story. There was an American pastor put in jail by Erdogan's government. The story of that liberation, that rescue, that bailout, so to speak, is a clear demonstration of the fact that these diplomatic efforts of Trump's administration have very, I would say, pragmatic, very effective, very practical consequences.
Now, what do we think about China's social doctrine of the church? It's a controversial topic, but we must address it. Is it the best example of social doctrine of the church? Well, conservative Catholics were shocked by Pope Francis's desire to embrace the totalitarian government of communist China, first by agreeing to replace underground churches with state-elected puppets, and then when a Vatican official said that those who achieve the best social doctrine of the church are the Chinese, according to the WND website. Argentine Bishop Marcelo Sanchez Arrondo praised Chinese-style communists and said the Chinese are pursuing the common good, subordinating things to the common good. China has defended the dignity of the human person and in the area of climate change assumes a role of moral leader that others have abandoned, he added. Well, the wave of criticism from the church was strong, as you may guess. Catholic author Paul Kenger wrote, "This, of course, leaves you speechless with astonishment. You couldn't even find a left-wing radical at the Huffington Post or even at The Nation that wouldn't be dumbfounded." Kenger said China is responsible for half of the global number of suicides among women and still practices population control and forced abortion.
We must address China because China is simply an atheistic country. I mean, obviously, communism was a doctrine put together by a disciple of Hegel, and that's a German philosopher living in the 19th century Berlin, by the name of Karl Marx. Karl Marx was born in 1818, and he was very much willing to destroy the foundations of the established church in Germany. He was not a believer himself, but he also thought that religion is the opium for the people. In his critique of Hegel, he says clearly that we have to reach happiness only by destroying our faith in God, to put it very simply. Now, Marx has destroyed many countries. I mean, the ideology of Karl Marx has destroyed many countries in our part of the world. We are living in a former communist country. That's Romania. We saw the destruction of churches in Poland. Perhaps we'll come back to that. We saw the destruction of churches in Russia. So Karl Marx and the communist ideology has already shown its inimical character towards Christianity. It's no news then for us that in China today we are witnessing a complete and utter destruction of lots of Christian churches. I think there were lootings last year which affected almost 2,000 churches. We are witnessing the destruction of also some other religious minorities. I think of Buddhists here in Tibet, for instance. And that's not good. I mean, we have to put pressure on China. We have to see more European diplomats putting pressure on China. We have to see more American diplomats putting pressure on China so that this persecution of Christianity will come to an end. The other thing that I want to mention is that if you read the documents of Xi Jinping, who is the current president of China, you'll realize he is a Leninist. I mean, he truly believes that in order to advance the cause of communism, you have to get rid of any faith in God. And why is that? Because Christianity preaches love, the power of love. Communism preaches the love for power. It's a radical contrast between the two. Christ has called us, including Xi Jinping, to serve others. Xi Jinping is willing, to dominate others, to exercise his willpower, just like Hitler, just like Stalin, just like Mao. He is a dictator of sorts. He's the most powerful man on the planet in terms of the free use of weapons or diplomatic and economic tools that can destroy other nations. And so, since we have seen what other communist dictators like Nicolae Ceausescu, like Josif Vissarionovich Stalin were able to do, since in the last century we have counted more than 100 million dead bodies killed in the name of communism, we have to be very, very careful when it comes to communist China today. We have to clearly expose them and ask them to change their behavior towards any free citizen who wants to embrace the gospel.
Mike, how do you comment Pope Francis's attitude towards China?
I have to say Pope Francis is no John Paul II. John Paul II was a bishop who grew up in interwar Poland. He was, I would say, a great philosopher. He was somebody who studied very well various philosophical doctrines. Why is that important? Because in order to understand the social situation, the social predicament of a country, you have to understand the ideas that are behind that particular social structure. So, when communism destroyed Eastern Europe and started to rule over our destinies, I think over 400 million Eastern Europeans were ruled by communism, beginning with 1945. John Paul II was a philosopher, a Christian philosopher, very much able to discern, what was behind, because he read Karl Marx, because he read Hegel, because he read German philosophy. John Paul II was very much, as I said, capable to show, to reveal the evil behind this egalitarian doctrine. Why is it evil to have an egalitarian view of the world? Because we are not born with the same inclinations, we are not born with the same gifts. Anna, your gifts are different from mine, and what we need to do in life is to multiply our gifts, my particular gifts, your particular gifts, so that at the end we can come into a common celebration and kind of symphony of reciprocity, which celebrates, as I said, the diversity or the genuine, true diversity of our condition. Now, what communism does is the opposite, is trying to destroy the particularity of your person or my person, and to treat us almost like if we were robots, without name, without a particular calling, without a particular gift, without a unique mission and vision, but we can all be part of an army led by the country leader or by the party leader towards an unknown future. I mean, that's the kind of philosophy of history that communism is setting forth. Why did I sort of have this parenthesis introduced in my response? Because in contrast to Pope John Paul II, Pope Francis grew up not in a communist country, but he grew up in Argentina, in a place where perhaps the extreme right, perhaps some even former fascist or Nazi organizations were still projecting a kind of influence. Pope Francis grew up in a country where, I'd say, the social condition of the poor was very dramatic. So, Pope Francis, as a Jesuit, started to look at the liberation theology handbooks that were widely circulated in South America. And he started to build a new philosophy, a Christian philosophy, in which egalitarianism, rather than individualism, is desirable. So, when Pope Francis has to give a kind of assessment of what's going on in China, he's more inclined to pardon, to forgive the atrocities of the Communist Party. Is that because he's just neglecting the suffering of the poor? I don't know. Is that because he's inclined towards a more leftist view of the world, of economics, of politics? Perhaps so. However, fortunately, apart from Pope Francis, who is only temporarily the leader of the Catholic Church, there are other bishops, including bishops who currently reside in Hong Kong, very much critical of Beijing, very much critical of the communist regime in China. And my hope and my prayer is that they will prevail. Just like the Christian leaders of Eastern Europe in the 1980s were smuggling, were introducing Bibles, prayer books, audio tapes, speeches, videotapes with Billy Graham, but perhaps also with other such leaders, Christian leaders, in our country, in other countries. Just like, as I said, Christians in Eastern Europe managed to destroy communism in the light of their faith, but also of the courage shown by John Paul II and Ronald Reagan. I genuinely hope, Anna Maria, that in the next decade or so, with the help of Donald Trump, with the help of Boris Johnson, with the help of other courageous leaders from the West, but also with the boldness of faith shown by lots of Chinese bishops and Christians alike, we will see, if not the destruction, then at least the appeasement of the beast, of the dragon, of the Communist Party in Beijing.
What about the destruction of Islam and Christianity, this new fusion where it's believed that Jesus in the Bible and Jesus Isa in the Quran are one and the same person? Religious fusion of Chrislam wins terrain. In almost every country in Europe, Christmas has been marked in recent years by controversy over Islam. A study by the Gatestone Institute shows that the most recent conflicts have been caused by multiculturalist political and religious elites in Europe who have worked hard to ostentatiously secularize Christmas to ensure that Muslims are not offended by the Christian holiday. Many traditional Christmas fairs have been renamed, such as Amsterdam is now known as Winter Parade, Brussels, the Joys of Winter, London, Winter Wonderland. But what is even more worrying are the attempts to Islamize Christmas. This re-ideology of Christmas is based on the false postulate that Jesus in the Bible and Jesus Isa in the Quran are the same person. This religious fusion, sometimes called Chrislam, is gaining ground in a West that has become biblical illiterate.
I'm not an expert on Islam. I have to say I did my best to read the Quran twice. I've tried to figure out what's there. And I have to say that my last impression is that the Quran is simply a Christian heresy. I mean, it's just a distortion of the genuine revelation of the Bible when it comes to the image of God. And I'm not surprised, throughout history, in the past, we have seen different attempts to subvert, to destroy, to pervert, to, blemish the genuine Orthodox, in a broad sense, Christianity that we've inherited from the apostles. So it's no news, again, the fact that some people try to overlap these two images, the Christ of the Gospel of John, for instance, and the Jesus of the Quran. They are not the same. The Christ of the Gospel of John, in particular, is the Son of the Father. He speaks with the same voice, as it were, which is the voice of the Father. There is no difference. There's no ontological, I would say, opposition. There's no substantial difference between the two. By the way, our creed, our Nicene Creed, says that they are of the same substance, yeah? That Christ is of the same substance with the Father. To translate that in a more accessible language, that means that the life of Christ is the same with the life of the Father in the Holy Spirit. Both the divinity of the Son and the divinity of the Holy Spirit are being rejected by Islam. Now, when it comes to theology, we can discuss this at length. But when it comes to social practices, that's more worrisome because, you might have your own belief, your system of belief, your faith, your individual, your private practice when it comes to religion. But what's appalling and what's disturbing is to see a public imposition of this view in our European schools, perhaps some public institutions like the Parliament, and so on and so forth. So what I don't want to see is an overlap between Christmas, on the one hand, our traditional Christian Christmas, so to speak, and the celebration of Islam in a public context.
Well, apparently now it's taken quite a big leap forward because the Muslims feel offended by this celebratory event of Christmas. Why should we change? Do you think it's necessary to change the name of Christmas fairs in order to make it more inclusive? Like several weeks ago in Romania, we had the dilemma of the gender identity, you know, and we had to figure out something that came from the United States, for example. How can we make it gender inclusive? Well, now, do you think we need to make it religious inclusive?
I don't think so. By the way, the name Christmas is a powerful name. Christmas comes from Christ, the Anointed One, Messiah in Hebrew. So Christ is very much a biblical figure, a son of David on the one hand in earthly terms, and the Son of God in theological divine terms. And Mass comes from Mass, that is a celebration, a liturgical celebration of that particular day when Christ was born. Christ was born from Mary, and he was celebrated by his disciples, by his early disciples, as being both the Son of David and the Son of God. That wonderful combination explains lots of things, such as the performance of miracles by Jesus, his transfiguration on Mount Tabor. He was full of light. His image, his face was basically dazzling. It was almost impossible to see Christ because, you know, your eyes would be blinded. You know, that was the experience of John and I think Peter. So you've got that divinity of Christ being very much celebrated by the Gospels, as well as his humanity. You know, he was able to weep when he saw his friend being dead. I think here of Lazarus, who passed away on that Saturday and he was resurrected. I think here of other moments in which he wept, like in the Gethsemane garden, right? So that particular celebration of Jesus' birth, when we see the Magi representing the elites, the cultural elites, right? The clever ones. The Magi is coming from Persia on the one hand, and the shepherds, the simpletons, the deplorables, so to speak, coming together at the manger, celebrating this birth. That beautiful image should never be overlapped with other images that come from the Quran. Their view of Jesus, from our point of view, is heretical, is not biblical. So why should I be forced to accept it? You know, I don't care. I mean, you might have your view, I might have my view, but in a democratic, pluralistic society, in a truly liberal democracy, we should, as Christians, be allowed to say what we believe, to act according to our conscience, and never be forced to embrace another perspective, another philosophy, or another religion. That would be totalitarianism.
Mike, you have studied the history of Marxism. How would you assess the communist persecution of Christianity in Eastern Europe, but specifically in Romania?
You're right, I have studied it, and I have to say that from Eastern Europe to China and from Laos to Venezuela, the followers of Marx and Engels used the most extreme forms of violence to annihilate religion. In many ways, the Bolsheviks only continued the French Jacobin hostility towards the throne and the altar. Vladimir Lenin said in 1905, our propaganda necessarily includes the propaganda of atheism. Leon Trotsky said also that the highest expression of serfdom is religion. Pravda, the official newspaper of the Soviet Union, never ceased to call priests the enemies of the people. During the Russian famine of 1922, Lenin claimed the Orthodox Church was hoarding gold and food as a pretext to confiscate its wealth. Leading Christian intellectuals such as Nikolai Berdyaev, Sergei Bulgakov, and Nikolai Losky were put on the philosopher's ship and forced into exile. Trotsky, who organized this trip, believed that all religions expressed, and I quote, an illogical primitive ignorance. This explains how even a scientific giant like the polymath, mathematician, and theologian Pavel Florensky was regarded as backward. By the late 1930s, Father Pavel ended up martyred by the NKVD in the Gulag archipelago close to St. Petersburg. The eminent British scholar Andrew Louth described the spiritual devastation that followed the October Revolution in the following words, and I quote, "The state of the church in the Soviet Union made it impossible for any theology to flourish. It was hard enough for the church to survive." According to Marxist theory, after the revolution, the church, as a manifestation of religion, was meant to fade away. As it didn't, its disappearance had to be encouraged, and the church experienced persecution far more severe than ever before. The great persecutions of the early church under the Roman Empire were episodic. With the structures of a modern state, the persecution of Christians in the Soviet Union could aim at the extermination of the church and very nearly succeeded. This is why, during the 20th century, the best works of Russian theology were written abroad. Nikolai Berdyaev, for instance, articulated a powerful defense of individual freedom and Christian personalism in stark opposition to the horrors of censorship and collectivism. It was not just the USSR that attacked religion. The repression of biblical faith was global. In 1948 China, the Communist Party destroyed Tibetan monasteries. Mongolian Marxists imposed strict limitations on traditional Lamaism. Communist activists distributed sarcastic commentary on the Holy Scripture. I read them when I was very young, and I had in my hands this so-called Jolly Bible, and I felt discouraged to go to church anymore. Teenagers like me were taught the basics of scientific atheism in public schools instead of religious education or even history of religion. Winter festivals replaced Christmas. Youth organizations such as the Young Pioneers taught children to disrespect family norms, the authority of parents, and the customs of the past. In Albania, dictator Enver Hoxha, who ruled from 1944 until 1985, wanted his nation to be the first, guess what? The first atheistic state on the planet, and they made it. After the Second World War, the Communist Party in Romania, which was very much under the control of Moscow, cut off all its relations with the Vatican and abolished the local Greek Catholic Church. Hundreds of Catholics, bishops, and priests ended up in labor camps, suffering in the harsh wilderness of the Danube Delta, and many Orthodox monasteries and lay associations, including evangelical associations, were dismantled. In November 1959, a state decree ordered that only elderly people living in Romania could take the monastic vows. About 5,000 monks and nuns were forcefully removed from their monasteries. Religious services were tolerated only as part of liturgical ghettos. For at least 2 decades, the church was deprived of any means of socializing work, missionary activities, or cultural events. The space for personal faith shrank dramatically. Pilgrimages were restricted. Priests performed only infant baptisms in secret. All books were taken out of circulation, if not burned. Other faith-based sects or communities, ranging from evangelical Christians to Jehovah's Witnesses, as well as small communities such as the Old Believers or the Zionist Jews, suffered themselves from political persecution. A particularly striking episode, which I want to relate to you right now, in the history of Romanian communism, was the birth and decline of a spiritual movement called the Burning Bush. The Burning Bush group, Rugul Aprins, which was founded by the summer of 1943. Under the inspiration of a Russian monk, anti-communist monk, Ivan Kulugin, John the Stranger, this association of laymen and clergymen located primarily here in Bucharest engaged in prayer, scriptural meditation, and philosophical reflection. So, as I said, from 1943 to 1947, after barely escaping the Bolshevik persecution in his homeland, this priest, Father John, who came from Optina-Pustin, a place very dear to Dostoevsky and Solovyov, decided to teach his Romanian disciples the art of prayer known as the Jesus Prayer, which is, by the way, described in the Pilgrim's Tale. After he imparted the wisdom of this hesychastic tradition, monkish tradition, to his friends, the fugitive priest was again arrested and deported to Siberia, where he died. Romania, in those days, in 1947, was at a cultural crossroad where East and West met naturally. However, communism hated both the Oriental origins of Christianity and the Western foundations of liberal democracy. For the highly educated friends of the Burning Bush movement, freedom of thought was an essential component of life and especially of religious life. The personal encounter with Jesus had a transformative effect by liberating the prayerful believer from the bondage of sin. So crass materialism could never explain to these great intellectuals of interwar Romania how thieves, tax collectors, and harlots could be turned into, yes, saints. So academics, such as this great Byzantine expert Alexandru Elian, or poets such as Vasile Voiculescu, Paul Sterian, and others, young monks such as Andrei Scrima, a great brilliant mind, or Sandu Tudor, or Roman Braga, who lived in America, in Michigan, or even a towering theologian like Dumitru Stăniloae, was a very well-respected university professor, and Dr. Philokalicus, as somebody put it. They all attempted to preserve both the Western civilization and to rediscover the ancient texts of the Bible, of the patristic authors, and of the Philokalia. Now, the people who met here in Bucharest, surrounding Father Ivan, they were part of a very non-violent, innocent group, which would always meet in a library, not anywhere else, not on the street, but rather in a library, in a monastery called Antim Monastery, where they would talk freely about literature, philosophy, and Christian spirituality. Now, somebody like Trotsky, somebody like Anna Pauker, somebody like Stalin thought that the complete abolition of such groups, such practices, would be attained in order to fully develop a socialistic structure, in order to be fully free from mystery. So Christians, ladies and gentlemen, both in Romania and in other parts of Eastern Europe, like the Christians today living in Africa or China, dedicated their entire life to this exploration of God, of the mystery of human consciousness and of happiness. Their desire to live fully with Christ is an impressive testimony of what faith can do for all of us. And what we have to do is just to honor their memory.
Thank you, Mike. This was our very first season, very first episode of Faith and Reason Liberty Hub. It was wonderful delving into those subjects with you, and I am sure there's so much more to say about them.
Thank you.